A few months ago, Twitter and Facebook decided to suspend the account of Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America. This spectacular event highlights the monumental power that social networks now possess and the enormous responsibility that comes with that power. The mass dissemination of certain information can destabilize governments and create health chaos, which in turn can threaten the well-being, health and safety of hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people around the world. Unfortunately, the choice of what will be moderated and what will be massively disseminated is today extremely opaque and centralized, since it is decided by a handful of leaders of very large companies or by some very powerful governments. Yet, any entity that has that much power, whether it is private, governmental or associative, will be bound to receive incentives but also pressure and threats from all sorts of entities. The centralization of decision-making, especially when it is opaque, and this is unfortunately the case in private companies and in many governments, this centralization and opaqueness is a central threat for the integrity of decisions. Therefore, to solve dilemmas like the suspension of former President Trump's account, or to solve the millions of billions of dilemmas that recommendation algorithms face, it seems critical to design decision-making tools that are both more collaborative and also more transparent. Today, we are going to talk about an absolutely fantastic research paper that proposes exactly these tools and thus allows to envision a future where the ethics of the world's most influential algorithms will be determined in a collaborative and transparent manner. Today, we are going to talk about one of my favorite articles in modern academic research. We're going to talk about WeBuildAI. WeBuildAI is a very general framework for collaborative ethics which has been applied to the particular case of the food donation problem faced by the non-profit organization 412 Food Rescue. This Pittsburgh, USA-based non-profit association organizes the delivery of food donations by donors, such as supermarkets, to recipients in need of food. Specifically, when donors want to donate food, typically because it is unsold leftovers, they call the 412. The 412 Food Rescue staff member then notes the parameters of the donation, such as the donor's identity, its geographic location, and the amount of food to be donated. He or she must then decide which volunteer should pick up the food donation and to which recipient the volunteer should deliver the donation. Now, each of these decisions is an ethical dilemma. By choosing to deliver to this school instead of this homeless center, the staff of 412 Food Rescue is indirectly denying the donation to the homeless center. Unfortunately, when the decision is made by a human staff, there is a significant risk that the human staff will experience a systematic bias favoring some recipients over others. Furthermore, the human decision-making process is opaque, which can be frustrating for the then disadvantaged recipient. Finally, for other use cases, there could be a risk that the human personnel could be influenced and even manipulated by entities that would require this person to favor certain recipients over others. More importantly, the human staff would then overlook the ethical preferences of other stakeholders affected by the decision-making. The donor might prefer that their food be delivered to homeless people in certain areas. The school receiving the food might actually prefer to have regular donations, and it may have received the donations just recently. The volunteers might prefer to minimize their time travel, even if it means that they have to travel longer distances. And the 412 Food Rescue staff might prefer to adhere to some principles in their donation logic. More generally, it seems that ideally, everyone affected by a decision should be consulted when making that decision. In fact, it might even be desirable to consult those that are not directly affected by the decision, as advocates of human rights and women's rights often demand when atrocities are committed in foreign countries that they themselves do not suffer from directly. However, all these consultations have the unfortunate disadvantage of requiring a great deal of time and human labor. In practice, like all organizations, 412 Food Rescue is an association with limited means and significant time constraints. In particular, each choice of a donation recipient must be made in a few minutes only. It is then impossible to consult all stakeholders in this very short time frame. In fact, stakeholders would certainly find such a commitment to decision-making too burdensome and therefore actually undesirable. In fact, just having human staff make this decision is actually costly for 412 Food Rescue. If it were possible to automate this decision while ensuring that it is being made better than what a human staff would do, then the human staff could make better use of their time, for instance by searching for other donors and recipients, thereby allowing more food to find takers in demand before the food expires. To solve the problem of the collaborative ethics for food donation, the central idea of WeBuildAI is to rely on what I will call algorithmic representatives. Or put another way, instead of soliciting humans every time a dilemma arises, WeBuildAI will solicit algorithmic representatives of humans and have them vote to determine which solution seems preferable. This can be seen as an analogy with representative democracy. In representative democracy, lawmaking and executive decisions are also too complex or too frequent to lend themselves to elicitation of the global population. The solution of representative democracy is to get each citizen to elect not laws or executive decisions, but to elect representatives who will write the laws or make the executive decisions. So, ideally, democratic representatives should perfectly represent the citizens who elected them. In other words, they should vote exactly as the citizens who elected them would vote. However, in practice, this representation of citizens is usually very imperfect. Indeed, in most representative democracies in the world today, this representation is catastrophically biased and opaque. One of the reasons for this is the inescapable political games between politicians, especially now that the job of political representatives is generally a very competitive career. And when the competition is tough, incentives prevail. This is probably why we often find ourselves today with politicians who will do anything to be and remain in power. But there is another reason why representative democracy is bound to be governed by representatives who are going to misrepresent the preferences of their constituents. Namely, human representatives represent an information bottleneck. After all, each representative often represents thousands, if not millions, of different individuals. It is then impossible for each representative to accurately represent each of their electors. In fact, it is impossible for them to adequately be informed about the preferences of all of their electors. To get around this information bottleneck, WeBuildAI proposes to design a custom representative for each voter. Each representative is then ultra-personalized. Each representative represents the preferences of a single voter. Moreover, because it is an algorithm, this ultra-customized algorithmic representative will be able to participate in a very large number of distinct dilemmas, and they can be extensively tested and audited by their human voter. And now, each time a dilemma arises, WeBuildAI then proposes to solicit all algorithmic representatives and have them voting. The solution that wins the vote of the algorithmic representatives will then be the ethical choice of WeBuildAI. There remains, however, the problem of designing ultra-customized algorithmic representatives. WeBuildAI proposes two solutions to achieve this. On the one hand, voters can design their own algorithmic representative. Such an algorithm would perhaps say, I prefer to give to this closest recipient, or I prefer to give to the recipient that has not received donations in the longest time within the top 5 closest recipients. Or, of course, it can be some more sophisticated algorithm. Unfortunately, this solution requires a certain comfort with the language of programming and a lot of time and attention to describe one's own preferences. And even with these skills and devotion, writing down our ethical preferences explicitly is actually a very tricky task. The other solution proposed by WeBuildAI is to rely on machine learning. More precisely, WeBuildAI will then propose dilemmas to a voter. Typically, it will present it with a scenario where a donor has just called and it needs to decide where the donation will be delivered among a set of options with different characteristics. WeBuildAI will then collect the voter's ethical preferences for this dilemma and for all sorts of similar dilemmas. From the data, WeBuildAI will then design a model of the voter that matches the judgments provided by the voter. The resulting model will then be an algorithmic representative of the voter. The main disadvantage of the second method is that the voter will not have written this algorithmic representative themselves. As a result, he must trust a priori the WeBuildAI algorithms. Now, to build this trust, WeBuildAI then proposes to the voter to interact with their representatives by testing the opinions of their representatives in other dilemmas. More importantly, the big advantage of this second method is that it is much easier for most voters to use it. This other approach seems much more scalable and seems much more likely to be able to engage a very large number of voters with diverse backgrounds and perhaps more importantly, with diverse amounts of commitments. It is for this reason that this method has also been proposed to determine the ethics of autonomous cars in an ethical situation, notably via the judgments provided on the MIT Moral Machines website, and to determine the ethics of kidney donation. And it is also for this reason that it is the solution that was adopted by the Tournesol project to solve the ethics of content recommendation. In addition to enabling collaborative ethics, according to the study conducted by its creators, WeBuildAI has made the decision-making process of the 412 Food Rescue Association more transparent and thereby has increased the trust of the various stakeholders in the association. Indeed, interviewed by the researchers, a volunteer explained that this is certainly more fair than somebody sitting at a desk trying to figure out on their own. These are everybody's brain power who were deemed to be important in the decision. It should be the most fair that you could get. An association staff member added that it is important to get input from everyone involved to challenge the organization's assumptions and increase the effectiveness of their work. A member of one of the recipient organizations shares this sentiment, stating that decision-making is more accurate by taking everyone's average. My model is only my experience, and I view my experience differently than the next place down the road, and my experience is subjective. That said, in an even more interesting way, WeBuildAI has above all allowed the various stakeholders to have a more positive image of the 412 Food Rescue Association, notably because they have then better understood the difficulty of the ethical dilemmas to which the association is constantly exposed and the association's concerns for the fairness in the way in which the recipients of the donations are determined. This has increased trust and motivation to work with the association. But perhaps best of all, WeBuildAI's interfaces and the efforts to design their representative algorithms themselves allowed the various stakeholders to understand and gain confidence in the algorithms used by 412 Food Rescue. Remarkably, an initially skeptical volunteer ended up trusting his algorithmic representative wholeheartedly. A non-profit staff member, initially frightened by the idea of designing their algorithmic representative, ended up finding WeBuildAI a very reasonable approach. Finally, one donor felt that his confidence also came from his interaction with the developers, who reassured him that they were committed to ethical considerations. Now, having said all of this, the solution implemented by WeBuildAI was not unanimously celebrated as perfect. In particular, a volunteer and a member of the association questioned the quality of the different voters' opinions, doubting both the voters' understanding of the issues and their ability to design a correct algorithmic representative. In order for WeBuildAI to become even more what we would want it to really be, it might be relevant to better identify the areas of expertise of the different stakeholders, to measure the degree of cognitive investment, and to estimate the uncertainty about whether the algorithmic representative is correct. These are definitely important changes for the future of the research in ethics and algorithmic safety. Rarely has a read made me so excited as the WeBuildAI paper did. This article represents a framework that solves many of the challenges that Professor Mahdi El Mhamdi and myself raised in our book, The Fabulous Endeavor. Even better, this fantastic framework has been deployed, and its deployment in a practical case shows how pragmatic and promising it is for all sorts of automatic decision-making problems with ethical issues. For instance, the ethical dilemmas of recommendation algorithms. And in fact, just a few months after reading WeBuildAI, some colleagues and I have decided to adapt WeBuildAI to content recommendation. Thus was born Tournesol. Tournesol is our proposal for collaborative ethics to hopefully one day solve the millions of billions of ethical dilemmas that determine so much of the future and the present of humanity. But of course, for this collaborative ethics to eventually work, it is critical that a very large number of contributors collaborate with us and design their algorithmic representatives on our platform so that we can then determine recommendations that result from the votes of a very large number of hopefully reliably designed algorithmic representatives. More than ever, to solve the ethics of information, we need you.